Stop. Before proceeding with watching the rest of this video or any of my other content, I'd like to make sure that you're at least familiar with the content that's in this video entitled Epilogue 1, How to Set Up Your Life. Stop watching online videos until you do this. Published on July 29th, 2023. If you already have successful friendships, a successful marriage, you're in a career that you enjoy, and you're in the process of or getting ready to start a family, then this lecture is not as essential. But if you're currently not in a state where you have a enriched support system, you're actively pursuing a romantic relationship or are in one, and you have a career that you enjoy and a well-established financial budget, please review this lecture first. Some of the content that you are potentially about to see will likely be controversial and perhaps even upsetting for some. I don't mean this to be patronizing, but I do mean to be intentional and state very clearly that it's much more important to have set up a series of beneficial relationships and have a full, rich life before pursuing any of this stuff. This is not information that you need to be learning about in isolation by yourself in front of a computer with no friends and close family. You're going to be able to help yourself, other people, much more, even if you never encounter the information beyond this disclaimer, if you have a successful relationship and a rich, full life already set up. Thank you so much for clicking on this video. I appreciate your time.
So this lecture is going to cover transgenderism, specifically in the context of esoteric traditions and occultic traditions and sort of ancient practices and practices of undeveloped cultures as it relates to transgenderism. Now, it's going to be quite a bit different substantially from lectures that I've covered in the past, so just be mindful of that. There will also be quite a bit of discussion on religion just as it relates to these ideas, mainly because we'll see that they're pretty much intertwined. A lot of this transgenderism stuff emerges in the form of opposition of more traditional religions, and we'll see this kind of over and over again, and in the opinions of the people trying to sort of advance these positions. There will also be a lot of discussion on homosexual behavior, largely because it's entwined with a lot of the sources that I'm using. We'll talk about homosexuality in more detail later, but that's not the main focus. Just bear this in mind that these ideas have been going on for thousands of years, and there's a multitude of other practices associated with this practice that I don't think most people are aware of. And we will discuss sort of the modern development of these ideas in subsequent lectures, as well as sort of brain structures that are involved in these thought processes, different psychological factors. All that stuff is going to be covered in these discussions as it relates to transgenderism, but it's important to understand where these ideas originally came from and the cosmogony that's often linked to hermaphroditism in a lot of these esoteric religions, etc., which seems to be affiliated with cultures that celebrate transgenderism. So let's continue on here.
So here we are finally on our first lecture on transgenderism, and it will come across very quickly that this discussion, in order to take things back to its origin, will take an immediate, very esoteric turn that many people may not expect. Having said that, let me just point out from the outset that it is important to take breaks from this stuff. And it is important not to perpetually dwell on this type of information, these type of esoteric sources. The number of people over the generations that have tried to tinker with esoteric sources and mystical sources and spent hours and hours poring over this stuff, and it resulted in very negative outcomes for them, is a substantial number of individuals. Okay, but it is important to understand and trace these ideas back to their origin, and it will serve us well to understand how these types of systems of thinking develop and how to best address them. And it's also essential to point out that these ideas and these movements, they don't manifest organically. They are manifesting now because of exorbitant amounts of financing and media control on a global scale, but they've existed far, far longer than that. As we'll see, there's references to some of these ideas, thousands of years ago in ancient Babylon, ancient Egypt, etc., etc. And if you look at some of their ritualistic practices, one of the first things that might spring to mind is, okay, why would we want to emulate any of those belief systems? But it's just, it from the outset, it needs to be pointed out, this is where we're going. The only way that you're going to develop an understanding of the purpose of these ideas is by looking at some of these esoteric sources and religious texts. But that does not mean that you should spend hours and hours reading through them, combing through every detail. And it helps to make it clear and understand that transgenderism is a phase among a series of phases that is trying to get us to a post-gender, post-human, post-sort of transhuman almost state. And this is one of the essential phases for that. And we will discuss some other phases after we finish up with transgenderism. We'll talk about homosexuality. We'll see how this lecture goes. I don't know if this is going to get to the level of something that will get taken down. All this stuff will be backed up on the Internet Archive. I don't think that it will, but eventually there will be some stuff that we talk about that's probably just going to go on the Internet Archive. So we'll see how this one goes, and we'll kind of progress through this series and just see where we're at. We're kind of testing out where the limits are before we get to some more increasingly controversial things. So starting with the basics of the transgender Wikipedia page, a transgender person, often abbreviated as trans, is someone whose gender identity differs from that typically associated with the sex they were assigned at birth. Many experience gender dysphoria, which they may seek to alleviate through transitioning, which they, shorthand here basically means you'll start on hormones, dress like the opposite sex, and potentially have your genitals inverted. Many experience gender dysphoria, in which they may seek to alleviate through transitioning, often adopting a different name and a set of pronouns in the process. So this is basically the roadmap here. They pursue gender-affirming care, such as hormone replacement therapy and various gender-affirming surgeries. So they get to immediately utilize the term affirming. So they get to take on that term for themselves. Not all transgender people desire these treatments, and others may be unable to access them for financial, medical, or legal reasoning. Again, in 2021, I did a lecture on Wikipedia itself when we were talking about capture of medical agencies and all those sorts of things. And so Wikipedia is very much a controlled enterprise. You can go back and reference that lecture if you're interested. Those who desire to medically transition to another sex may identify as transsexual. It's an umbrella term. It may include people who are quote-unquote non-binary. Other definitions of transgender also include people who belong to a third gender or else conceptualize transgender people as a third gender. Some two-spirit people may also identify as transgender. What does two-spirit mean? Is a modern pan-Indian umbrella term used by some of the indigenous peoples in the Americas and Canada to describe themselves and other native people who fulfill a traditional third gender ceremonial or social role in their cultures. Statistics vary wildly. Some countries, such as Canada, perform census data, and it's below 1% of the worldwide population, somewhere between less than 0.1% to 0.6%. I would argue it was probably prior to Bruce Jenner appearing on the cover dressed of whatever that magazine was, dressed as a woman. I would wager that the numbers were substantially closer to this less than 0.01% than they are to the 0.06%. First thing they say is one of the first things they say in these opening section is that they face discrimination in the workplace, accommodations. In many countries, they're not legally protected from discrimination. Various terms were used to identify a person as transsexual and later transgender. imported from Germany and ultimately modeled after German transsexualismus, coined in 1923. The English term transsexual has enjoyed international acceptability, though transgender has been increasingly referred to as preferred over transsexual. The word transgender acquired both its modern umbrella term meaning in the 1990s. So they'll say psychiatrist John F. Olivan of Columbia University used the term in 1965 to reference work Sexual Hygiene and Pathology, stating that transsexualism is misleading and is not a factor primary in transvestitism. It was popularized in varying definitions by various transgender, transsexual, and transvestite people, including Virginia Prince, who used transgenderol in December 1969 issue of Transvestia, a national magazine for cross-dressers she founded. We see this trajectory. It's actually this is pretty late to the game where they're introducing these concepts in the 1960s. We far predate this. Even this modern interpretation of what we would think of as transgenderism far predates the 1960s, which we will get into later. By 1984, transgender community had developed. Leslie Feinberg's pamphlet, and that's this person right here, an American butch lesbian transgender activist, communist, and author, Stone Butch Blues in 1993. Her writing, notably Stone Butch Blues, and her pioneering nonfiction work, Transgender Warriors, laid the groundwork. It circulated in 1992 as a term to unify all forms of gender nonconformity. In this way, transgender has become synonymous with queer. And there's all sorts of debates in the online community about all this stuff. Here we have a much better accounting inspired by Magnus Hirschfeld's 1923 term, Seelischer transsexualismus. The term transsexual was introduced to the English in 1949 by David Oliver Caldwell and popularized by Harry Benjamin in 1966. Around the same time, transgender was coined and began to be popularized. Mr. Hirschfeld will feature much more prominently than we're seeing here, as he deserves far more than just this single sentence that's being granted in this transsexual paragraph. And then we've skipped to non-binary identity, and then transvestitism, and then drag. And then here we have older information. They say transgender people have existed since ancient times. A wide range of societies had traditional third gender roles or otherwise accepted trans people in some form. And of course, their reference for that is from 2022. Precise history is difficult because the modern concept of being transgender and gender in general did not develop until the mid-1900s. Historical understandings are thus inherently filtered through modern principles and largely viewed through a medical lens until the late 1900s. The Hippocratic Corpus describes the disease of the Scythians, which it attributes to impotency due to riding on a horse without stirrups. This therefore was well discussed in the medical writings of the 15 and 1700s. Pierre Petit, writing in 1596, viewed the Scythian disease as a natural variation, but by the 1700s viewed it as a melancholy or hysterical psychiatric disease. By the early 1800s, being transgender, separate from Hippocrates' idea of what it was claimed to be widely known, but remained poorly documented, both trans women and trans men were cited in European insane asylums of the early 1800s. One of the earliest recorded transgender people in America was Thomas Hall, a 17th century colonial servant. The most complete account of the time came from the life of Chevalier d'Eon, a French diplomat. Cross-dressing became more widespread in the late 1800s. Discussion of transgender people increased greatly, and writers attempted to explain the origins of being transgender. Much study came out of Germany and was exported to other Western audiences. Cross-dressing was seen as in a pragmatic light until the late 1800s. It previously served a satirical or disguising purpose, but in the latter half of the 1800s, cross-dressing and being transgender became increasingly viewed as a societal danger. So notice in this paragraph how many things have been conflated here with the cross-dressing and the transgender, and there's different things here that are being integrated with each other. And it's a little disingenuous to suggest that this disease of the Scythians is the same thing as what we're observing in modern culture, as it relates to transgenderism. But again, we'll explore a lot of this history in more detail. This is just some overview stuff. William A. Hammond wrote in 1882 of accounts of transgender Pueblo shamans, comparing them to the Scythian disease. Other writers of the late 17 and 1800s, including Hammond's associates, have noted widespread nature of transgender cultural practices among native peoples. Explanations varied, but authors generally did not ascribe native transgender practices to psychiatric causes, instead condemning the practices in a religious and moral sense. Obviously, the opponent of the transgender movement does appear to be religious groups, primarily more than anyone else. I believe there's some opposition from atheists or individuals that happen to be atheists because they believe that there's some inconsistent intellectual properties there, but it's clearly the religious folks, Muslims, Christians, etc., that are the ones that are resisting these movements the most. And of course, historically, we see that's also the case. Native groups provided much study on the subject, and perhaps majority of all study until after World War II. Again, the article that they're using is from 2020, so they don't have a reference from the time. They have a retroactive reference from 2020, and something that we've seen whenever we were talking about virology over and over again, where they would reference something that took place 100 years ago, and then the article would be from 2015, and we see the same thing here. Critical studies first began to emerge in the late 1800s in Germany with the works of Magnus Hirschfeld. He coined the term transvestite in 1910 as the scope of transgender study grew. His work would lead to the 1919 founding of the Institut für Sexualwissenschaft in Berlin. Though Hirschfeld's legacy is disputed, he revolutionized the field of study. We'll see just how disputed later on. That's a pretty big skip over there. The institute was destroyed when the Nazis seized power in 1933, and the research was infamously burned in May 1933 Nazi book burnings. Transgender issues went largely out of the public eye until after World War II. Even when they emerged, they reflected a forensic psychology approach, unlike the more sexological approach that had been employed in the lost German research study that Hirschfeld had generated. So then they talk about sexual orientation and mental health and physical health and detransitioning. And they say the rates of detransitioning vary from as much as less than 1% to as high as 13%, and 8% reported some kind of detransition. Most of those who detransitioned did so only temporarily. 62% of those who had detransitioned reported they were currently living full-time in a gender different than the gender that they were thought to be at birth. These statistics are interesting, and we will break them down in more detail later because, once again, Wikipedia is being a little bit disingenuous here. So we have different countries being acknowledged here. India declares it a third gender in law. The United States, Canada, Iceland, Germany, Denmark, just Europe in general. Feminist views on transgender women have changed over time, but they've generally been positive. We do see a clash between transgender individuals and a lot of homosexuals because they don't want to be with, feel like they're being pushed to participate in relationships with transitioned people, quote unquote transitioned people. And their response is basically, no, I'm not attracted to you because I don't view you as being the same sex as me. And as just an aside here, as far as religious groups go, they're certainly less resistant than they were in the past. The Catholic Church has started outreach to the LGBT community, and the Church of England passed a motion that would ensure Anglican churches accepted transgender people with their new name transcribed on them. So for anyone that's read the Bible in any context, it's pretty clear about gender roles. So, and I would argue, in Islam, if you've read the Quran, it's pretty clear about how they would feel about this sort of thing. So it's clear that these churches are not, they care more about how they're perceived than they do about what the text that they're supposed to be following. Whether you believe that text or not, they're supposed to believe it. So they don't really appear to have that much conviction about their belief system. They say there's lots of discrimination and they get lots of sport. And then the scientific studies, estimated ratio of 1 to 4 to 1 trans women to trans men for those requesting sex reassignment surgery. And of course, there's no citation for that. Again, we'll look at more of this information later. In Asia, we have Thailand and multiple different categories there. So perhaps the less said about that, the better. In the United States, some Native American and First Nation cultures traditionally recognize the existence of more than 2 genders, such as the Zuni male-bodied El Hamana. Biologically male people who take on the social and ceremonial roles usually performed by women in their culture at least some of the time, wear a mixture of women's and men's clothes. I would argue that's probably different than what our current understanding is, but we're seeing historically there are multiple cultures that incorporate some level of masculinization or feminization of the different sexes. So we have all the pride symbols and marches. Okay. What I don't see referenced here is sort of the concept, the ancient concept of the androgyne or intersex group of people, which is what this originally referenced. It originally referenced individuals who had partial formation, genitalia representative of both genders, and it necessitated some level of surgery or hormones or whatever else. And at previous points in history, that those types of things weren't available. So we have in the Jewish tradition, the term androgynos, translated to intersex, refers to someone who possesses both male and female sexual characteristics. Due to the ambiguous nature of the individual sex, rabbinic literature discusses the gender of the individual and the legal ramification that results based on potential gender classifications. In traditionally observant Judaism, gender plays a central role in legal obligations. So this is very important for the Jewish tradition. Why? Because they have laws that are prescribed explicitly based on gender. And so a curiosity such as this has to be explicated to the finest degree to understand exactly how this person is supposed to behave. And so they go on to describe the biological basis for this. They say it's possible, though exceedingly rare, for a mix-up to occur. One possibility is the genetic male does not produce enough testosterone because the fetus does not sense testosterone and reacts by forming female genitalia in addition to the already present male genitalia. Second way this can happen is if testosterone, which is normally exclusively produced in the testicles, is produced in another area of the body. A genetic female recognizes it and generates male genitalia along with the already present female genitalia. A distinction from tum-tum, the Jewish androgynous, refers specifically to an individual who appears to have both male and female genitals. So what is tum-tum in Judaism is a term that refers in the Jewish rabbinic literature, usually refers to a person whose sex is unknown because they're hidden, underdeveloped, or difficult to determine, and they are distinguished from androgynos in the rabbinic literature. It does not appear in Scripture. It does appear in other literature. Reform Rabbi Elliot Kukla writes the tum-tum appears 7 times in the Mishnah, 23 times in the Tosefta, 119 times in the Babylonian Talmud, 22 times in the Jerusalem Talmud, and hundreds of times in the Midrash, commentaries, and Halacha. Although tum-tum does not appear in the Babylonian Talmud, Yevamot 64ab, Rabbi Ami says that the biblical figures Abraham and Sarah were originally tum-tumin and infertile and then miraculously turned into fertile husband and wife in their old age. Rabbi Ami points to the book of Isaiah, saying the reference, "Look to the rock from where you were hewn, and the hole of pit from where you were dug. Look to Abraham, your father, and to Sarah, who bore you," explain their genitals being uncovered and remade. Scholars today differ in whether they see it as a distinct gender. 2nd century CE Mishnah, the oldest compendium of the oral Torah, brings the opinion of Rabbi Meir that tum-tum is not a distinct gender, but a state of doubt between male and female. Sometimes he is a man and sometimes he is a woman. So this is 1800 years ago. We had rabbis speculating on this topic. Back to the androgynous article. As far as early references in Jewish literature, Though not explicitly mentioned anywhere in the Hebrew Bible, the idea of androgynos is brought up in Genesis Rabbah, a Jewish commentary on the Bible written sometime between 300 CE and 500 CE. The commentator asserts that Adam in the story of creation was created by God as an androgynos. It continues to say later, when Eve was fashioned from his rib, God separated out the sexes, assigning Adam as male and Eve as female. While there are commentators who disagree with this approach of Genesis Rabbah, the explanation has become well-known and respected theory within Jewish biblical interpretation. The widely studied commentator Rashi is one notable example of a personality who adapted this approach. It is a topic first expanded upon explicitly in the Mishnah, where the debate arises as to the individual classification as either male or female. The Talmud discusses it primarily in two places, in Tractate Bikurim and in Tractate Yevamot. One opinion in Tractate Bikurim indicates that the androgynos has elements of the male, elements of the female, elements of both, and elements of neither. The other opinion insists that it is its own sex, a category unto itself. Yevamot conducts a much lengthier analysis where a variety of different approaches are considered in light of opinions established in Bikurim. In these discussions, the Talmudic personalities delineate four theoretical categories into which androgynos may fall. The sex of the individual is unknown. They may be male or may be female, but their true identity remains in doubt. They're their own sex. They're both male and female. They're considered male because they possess male characteristics. They belong to the male sex. Rabbi Moshe Sternbuch writes that an individual with ambiguous genitalia should always undergo surgery to become male. The one exception to this rule is the individual has evident female genitalia, but also has extra external structures. Nonetheless, it is universally agreed within Orthodox Judaism that a person with clear phenotypical gender may not voluntarily undergo sex reassignment surgery. Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, author of the book Tzitzit Eliezer, contends that generally gender is solely dependent on external anatomy, and thus if even one has the internal characteristics of chromosomal conformation of one sex, yet exhibits the genitalia of the other sex, their sex follows their external anatomy. Rabbi Waldenberg also permits an androgynous individual who would be truly female following surgery, determined by medical scans and genetic tests, to undergo surgery to become externally female. So we see the origins of this idea and explications on it far predate, the 1800s or even the 1600s. From Chabad.org in Kabbalah, the female aspect of Adam. They say the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon man, and he slept, and he took one of his sides and closed his flesh in place and brought her to the man. It is known that Adam was the epitome to all creation, handiwork of God himself, and he included all holiness and all of his souls in Israel. The entire side of holiness was connected to him and included him in him. Adam originally included both male and female, since he was created with two connected bodies. This is from Kabbalah Online. This is not something you're going to read if you pull up a Bible and read Genesis. Everything in the world must contain the concept of both male and female. This is especially true in serving God, where the male and female elements correspond respectively to remember and keep, referring to Shabbat. The essence of the male and female elements respectively is the concept of giving and receiving. A person can attain greater attachment, holiness, and purity of thought. Such a person then gives spiritual delight to the supernal lights, universes, and attributes. This is the concept of the male element. At the same time, however, this person receives spiritual sustenance from the supernal universes. This is the concept of this female element. All Israel also partakes of this female element. When this sustenance is transmitted to them, providing them with everything they need, from it they receive children, life, and food, and the like. The concept on high that bestows spiritual sustenance is the male. The spiritual flux becomes the semen, and the male and female essences come through to once again give birth through transmission of love to the world. Besides its immediate effect, each deed also affects future generations. This deed is then aroused, giving birth to another spiritual flux at a future date. Here we have Genesis Rabbah, which is referenced previously. It's from sacredtext.com. If they are unworthy, the I from the word Aish and the H from the word Vash is taken away, and thus IH, God departs, and there are left the words Ashavash, which equals fire and fire. Adam was created with two bodies, one of which was cut away from him and formed Eve. If man had been created out of spiritual elements only, there could be only death for him in the event of his fall. If, on the other hand, he'd been created out of matter, only there could there be no future bliss for him. And here we are, Bereshit Rabbah, and from Sefaria.org, chapter 8. And here we can see the Hebrew, just so I'm not accused of taking these things out of context. Said Ar Yemira ben Eleazar, in the hour when the Holy One created the first human, he created him as an androgynos. As it is said, male and female he created them. Said Ar Shmuel bar Nachmani, in the hour when the Holy One created the first human, he created him from a double-faced prospone do parsfin, and sawed him and made him backs, a back here and a back there, as it is said, back and before you formed me. They objected to him, but he took one of his ribs and said to him, one of his sides, just as you would say, and for the side of the tabernacle, which they translate. In the time that the Holy One created Adam Harashon as a golem, he created him, and he set him up for one end of the world, and unto his other end that what is written, your eyes saw my golem. Ar Yeshua bar Nechmiva and Ar Yedua bar Simon and Ar Eleazar's name said, he created him filling the whole world. From where do we extend from the east to the west? So this idea is pretty explicit in rabbinic literature. And we have, quote unquote, 6 sexes in the Talmud from Sefaria.org. Androgynos, an intersex person, 149 references in the Mishnah and Talmud, 350 in classical Midrash and Jewish law codes. And here we have a lonit, a literal ram, a female who has not shown physical types of sexual maturity by the age of 20, some say 18. Ish, a man one whose fertility is not in question and has shown some secondary sex characteristics by the age of 13. Esha, a woman, one whose fertility is not in question, sex characteristics by the age of 12, clearly by 12.5. Saris is a male who has not shown typical sexual maturity by the age of 20. A eunuch, 156 references in the Mishnah and Talmud, 379 in classic Jewish law. Saris trauma, congenital sterility in the male. Saris Adam, a castrated male. And then we have tum-tum once again. So this classification of sexes in the Talmud is far different than what modern gender theorists are conceiving of when they reference all these different genders. However, the androgynos thing is explicitly clear in rabbinic literature. So we have 8 genders in the Talmud for Juniverse here, and here's all the symbols associated with them. Now, this article is from 2015, and we see an expansion of these quote-unquote genders that is going to be in disagreement with a lot of Orthodox Jewish interpretation of these texts. We see this Reddit article asking a question about this and saying that this has been addressed and saying that this is a modern myth, that these ideas have been misinterpreted, at least as it relates to the Talmud. What about some other esoteric references to this concept, this idea of hermaphrodism or transsexualism? And of course, we see these ideas where? Well, in the concept of Freemasonry. This is the text Morals and Dogma of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite by Albert Pike. For those of you that are familiar with this figure, he has quite an interesting history, quite interesting connections. Much has been said of Masonry. I touched on the fact that Edward Jenner, the progenitor of vaccinations and the earliest developer of the idea of viruses, was in fact a Freemason. Whenever I talked about virus isolation, I believe in the first lecture on virus isolation I covered. And so we see here this concept once again. Reading from Morals and Dogma, here we are on page Here we are on page 653. Remembering what we have already said elsewhere in regard to the old ideas concerning the deity. So he's referring to a specific God. Now they have a different conception of God than does Islam or Christianity or many of the other conceptions of religions. They're sort of an amalgamation of ideas from various traditions that get included into Masonry. There's this idea of a demiurge and things like that. So just keep this in mind as we're reading this. And repeating it as little as possible, let us once more put ourselves in communion with the ancient and poetic philosophic mind and endeavor to learn of it what it thought and how it solved the great problems that have ever tortured the human intellect. So he's referring to this deity. He's saying, let's try to commune with it and let's see how it solved all these, ancient philosophical questions. The division and first supreme cause into two parts, one active and the other passive, the universe agent and patient, or the hermaphroditic God world, is one of the most ancient and widespread dogmas of philosophy or natural theology. Almost every ancient people gave it a place in their worship, their mysteries, and their ceremonies. So we see this reference in Masonry to even more ancient ideas from which Masonry borrows many of its symbols and ideologies and amalgamates into one belief system, that there's this concept of a hermaphroditic agent or a hermaphroditic God that he wants us to try and commune with. Ocellus Lucanus, who seems to have lived shortly after Pythagoras, opened his school in Italy 500 or 600 years before our era, and in the time of Solon, Thales, and other sages who had studied in the schools of Egypt. Not only recognized the eternity of the universe and its divine character as an unproduced and indestructible being, but also the distinction of active and passive causes, in what he terms the grand whole, or the single hermaphroditic being that comprehends all existence, as well as its causes and effects, in which is a system regularly ordered, perfect, and complete of all natures. He well apprehended the dividing line that separates existence eternally the same from that which eternally changes, the nature of the celestial from that of terrestrial bodies, and that of causes from that of effects, that which is from that which only becomes, a distinction that naturally struck every thinking man. So what do we see here? There's this idea of a grand whole that can comprehend all existence. And we're trying to commune with this thing, remember. It's a higher order thing, and one of the features of this supposed higher order thing is that it is in fact hermaphroditic. The doctrine of Ocellus was a general doctrine everywhere is naturally occurring to make the same distinctions. The Egyptians did so in selecting those animals in which they recognized these emblematic qualities in order to symbolize the double sex of the universe. Their god Neph, out of whose mouth issued the Orphic egg, remember this is their cosmogony here, their conception of the origin of the universe, whence the author of Clementine Recognitions makes a hermaphroditic figure to emerge, uniting in itself the two principles whereof heaven and the earth are forms, and which enter into the organization of all beings, which the heavens and earth engender by their concourse, furnishes another emblem of the double power, active and passive, which the ancients saw in the universe and which they symbolized by the egg. Orpheus, who studied in Egypt, borrowed from the theologians of that country the mysterious forms under which the science of nature was veiled, and carried into Greece the symbolic egg with its division in two parts or causes caused by the hermaphroditic being that issued from it, and whereof heaven and earth are composed. The Brahmins of India expressed the same cosmogonic idea by a statue representative of the universe uniting itself in itself both sexes. The male sex offered an image of the sun, center of the active principle, and the female sex that of the moon, at the sphere whereof, proceeding downward and passive portion of nature begins. The lingam unto the present day, revered in the Indian temples, being but the conjunction of the organs of the generation of the two sexes, was an emblem of the same. The Hindus have ever had the greatest veneration for this symbol of ever reproductive nature, and they say the Greeks consecrated the same symbols. And he does go on to this sun and moon stuff, which you see all the time. He references the zodiac, which is one of the many reasons I'm not into astrology people that are all about the astrology stuff. He says these causes were not only classed in the progressive order of their energy, heaven and earth heading the respective list, but distinct sexes were in some sort assigned to them, and characteristics analogous to the mode in which they concur in universal generation. But remember, this perfect being is a hermaphroditic figure that we're supposed to be communing with. Here we are on page 734. Force was known to the agents. It's a universal agent whose supreme law is equilibrium, and whereby, if science can but learn how to control it, it will be possible to change the order of the seasons, to produce in night the phenomena of day, to send a thought in an instant around the world, to heal or slay at a distance, to give our words universal success, and to make them reverberate everywhere. So there is a goal in mind here with these practices that they're asserting. The ability to heal somebody or slay somebody at a distance. The ability to change the seasons or alter weather patterns via the use of science in a combination with the principles he's espousing in this esoteric belief system. The agent, partially revealed by the blind guesses of the disciples of Mesmer, so mesmerism, we've actually referenced this before when we were talking about auditory fields and visual fields and hypnosis, is precisely what the adepts of the Middle Ages called elementary matter of the great work. You'll see reference to the great work many times over. The Gnostics held that it composed the igneous body of the Holy Spirit. So this is a derivation of Christianity. If you look up Gnosticism, it's largely an inversion of Christianity in which essentially the God ascribed to, and this is a very basic summarization, and Gnostics are known for conflating words, so I'm sure that they would disagree with this interpretation, but whatever. Essentially, the God that the Christians think of as the Judeo-Christian God was a fool, and the God and the figure Lucifer, who brought quote-unquote knowledge and light to human beings, was essentially the true hero of the story here. And you can see a literary reference to this in the form of Milton's Paradise Lost. I'm not making any comments one way morally, one way or the other, but just to provide you with some context based on whatever your pre-existing belief system is. Maybe you think Gnosticism is just the best thing ever. I don't know. But the Gnostics held that it composed the igneous body of the Holy Spirit, and it was adored in the secret rites of the Sabbat, or the temple, under the hieroglyphic figure of Baphomet, or the hermaphroditic goat of Mendes. Many people are familiar with Baphomet at this point. It's the goat-headed thing with the pentagram on its chest that has male and female part. There's a life principle of the world, a universal agent wherein are two natures and a double current of love and wrath. The ambient fluid penetrates everything. It is a ray detached from the glory of the sun and fixed by the weight of the atmosphere and the central attraction. It is the body of the Holy Spirit, the universal agent, the serpent devouring its own tail. With its electromagnetic ether, this vital and luminous caloric, the ancients and the alchemists were familiar. Of this agent, that phase of modern ignorance termed physical science talks incoherently, knowing not of it save its effects, and theology might apply it all its pretended definitions of spirit. So what do we see here? We see the concept of the Ouroboros. Now, in one of the, I believe it was one of the What Are We Are, What Are We Doing lectures, which would be either lecture 51 or 52, I referenced this with the technology of the Oura ring, which is literally symbolized as a circle, and it's keeping track of your biometric data like people's Apple Watches. These symbols don't come out of nowhere. And he's also referencing electromagnetic fields here as well, which I've spent multiple lectures discussing at this point in relation to COVID and negative health effects, connecting them with diabetes, cancer, all these sorts of things. So, and this text was written in the 1800s by a master mason. And what is he linking these ideas to? He's linking a lot of these ideas to hermaphroditic agents. The hermaphroditic figure is the symbol of the double nature ancient assigned to the deity as the generator and producer, as Brahm and Maya among the Aryans, Osiris and Isis among the Egyptians. As the sun was male, so the moon was female, and Isis was both the sister and wife of Osiris. The compass, therefore, is the hermetic symbol of the creative deity and the square of the productive earth, the universe. So for those of you that are familiar with Freemasonry, their symbol is what? It's a big G with a square and compass. So what's the compass for? It's a symbol for the hermetic symbol for the creative deity. Well, what's the creative deity? It's the hermaphrodite, and they literally use the term hermetic to describe it, referencing Hermes, because we have all this Egyptian sort of methodology. So they're including all these ancient belief systems, symbols, into their own belief system, and the square of the productive earth or universe. So that's what the symbols of Freemasonry stand for. From the heavens comes the spiritual and immortal portion of man. From the earth is the material and mortal portion. The Hebrew Genesis says that Yahweh formed man of the dust of the earth and breathed into his nostrils a breath of life. Through the 7 planetary spheres, represented by the mystic ladder of the Mithraic initiations, and it by that which Jacob saw in his dream, not with 3 but with 7 steps. So he's referencing the Old Testament here. He's referencing Hebrew traditions. The souls emanating from the deity descended to be united to their human bodies, and through those 7 spheres they must reascend to return to their origin and home in the bosom of the deity. Let's investigate that for a second. So he's referencing Jacob's ladder in the Old Testament, and he's saying that the souls of human beings were an emanation. They came from this hermaphroditic deity. They united with human bodies, and then they're going to, quote unquote, reascend by 7 spheres to return to their origin and home in the deity. So how is that process supposed to take place, those 7 spheres? The symbol of the heavens represents the spiritual, intellectual, and moral portion of the double nature of humanity. The square, the symbol of the earth, its material, sensual, and baser portion. Truth and intelligence, said one of the ancient Indian sects, are eternal attributes of God, not of the individual soul, which is susceptible both of knowledge and ignorance, of pleasure and pain. Therefore, God and the individual soul are distinct, and this expression of the ancient Naya philosopher in regard to truth has been handed down to us through the long succession of ages in the lessons of Freemasonry, wherein we read that truth is a divine attribute and the foundation of every virtue. While embodied in matter, the soul is in a state of imprisonment and is under influence of evil passions. But having by intense study arrived at the knowledge of the elements and principles of nature, it attains unto the place of the eternal, in which state of happiness its individuality does not cease. The vitality which animates the mortal frame, the breath of life of the Hebrew Genesis, the Hindu philosopher in general held, perishes with it, but the soul is divine, an emanation of the Spirit of God, but not a portion of that Spirit, for they compared it to the heat and the light sent forth of the sun, ray of light, which neither lessens nor divides its own essence. So there's this idea repeatedly that there's this ascendancy and this reunitation that needs to take place through the understanding of this esoteric hidden knowledge or whatever that's going to take place. And the deity that's referenced over and over again is hermaphroditic. So if you can experience, quote, the male and female, are you not in a closer communion with this said deity? Now, am I saying every single person that's ever participated in Freemasonry at any level totally wants to be a hermaphrodite or totally wants everybody else to be a hermaphrodite or transgender or whatever? No, I'm not saying that, okay? I am not a Mason, and I definitely would not want to become a Mason. I've met people that are Masons that seem perfectly nice. If you've looked up any of their rituals and stuff online, though, it's not something I would want to be a part of, and it's not something that, particularly given the secretive nature of the organization, secret handshakes and all sorts of, ritualistic type behaviors, it's just not something I'd ever want to participate in, nor something that I would ever trust. So I'm not trying to paint with a broad brush here. There are many different lodges. There's many different tiers of Masonry as far as like what level you are and what's revealed to you at what levels and all those sorts of things. So again, I'm not saying all Masons are the same. I'm saying this idea has been present for a long time in many esoteric traditions, some of which are quite powerful. If you've ever read the book Builders of Empire, which I'm sure you could find at libgen.is, it discusses the influence of Freemasonry basically on the development of the world. And you can specifically think of, in the context of America, how many of our founding fathers were Masons. So the idea is that this influence of this belief system couldn't have far-reaching consequences is pretty ridiculous to me. So take that what you will. This isn't designed to be a critique of Masonry as much as it is to demonstrate to individuals just how prevalent the belief system in this unified sex, changing sex idea is throughout many different esoteric systems. So it bears worth noting when we find it being pushed so heavily across the developed world. And so here we find ourselves looking at The Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall, a work I referenced briefly in one of the Where We Are, Where We're Going lectures, which is either lecture 51 or 52. I can't remember which at this point in time. It's been probably a year, more than a year ago at this point. And so we see this, again, an amalgamation of esoteric traditions being taught here. And I believe I retrieved this from libgen.is, but if not, it was from the Internet Archive. And so we see he's combining the Kabbalah with a Q, alchemy, tarot, ceremonial magic, Neoplatonic philosophy, mystery religions, and the theory of Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry. Although there are some questionable and controversial parts of the book, such as the outdated material on Islam, the portion on Bacon's Shakespeare hypothesis, and Hall's conspiracy theory of history, as driven by an elite cabal of roving immortals, they are far outweighed by the comprehensive information here on other subjects. So a lot of the times whenever you pull this stuff up, it's been given a treatment like this, a modernized, well, just so you know, there's going to be some of this stuff, so let's warn you ahead of time about, taking some of this stuff too seriously. And we've actually observed this when we looked at many of our other psychological lectures, talking about the bandwagon effect and the illusion of explanatory depth way back in 2021, which essentially that your first exposure to something has a large part in your formation of your belief about that thing. So they're going to make sure that anytime somebody gets exposed to new information, they're the ones that provide you with the initial framework for thinking about it here. But this was written in 1928, and here we have on page 98, Nature, beholding the descent, wrapped herself about the man whom she loved, and the two were mingled. For this reason, earthy man is a composite. Within him is the sky man, immortal and beautiful, without his nature mortal and destructible. Thus, suffering is the result of the immortal man's falling in love with his shadow and giving up reality to dwell in the darkness of illusion. So this is an idea that's expressed multiple times. You know, you can think of Plato's allegory of the cave, sort of being in love with sort of believing in a fake reality that's being projected on the wall instead of what's outside of the cave. Or also this idea of a shadow, present a lot in Carl Jung's work, which is one of the reasons why I wouldn't trust the work of Carl Jung or people that expound on and explicate his ideas like Jordan Peterson, just as an FYI there. But reading on, for being immortal, man has the power of the seven governors, also the life, the light, and the world, but being mortal, he is controlled by the rings of the governors, fate or destiny. So there's this form of quote-unquote apotheosis being referenced here, this idea that you can achieve your own salvation and immortality, and you're either have the power of these seven governors or the rings of these seven governors. So take that for what you will, but here we're coming to the part where it relates to transgenderism. Of the immortal man, it should be said that he is hermaphrodite, or male and female, and eternally watchful. So in case it wasn't explicit enough when we were talking about Freemasonry, here we're basically saying the highest state of man is a hermaphrodite. He neither slumbers nor sleeps and is governed by a father, also both male and female, ever watchful. Such is the mystery kept hidden to this day. For nature, being mingled in marriage with the sky man, brought forth a wonder most wonderful. 7 men, all bisexual, male and female, upright of stature, each one exemplifying the nature of the 7 governors. These, O Hermes, are the 7 races, species, and wheels. So we have more cosmogony here, more discussion on the origin of life and living things in the universe. After this manner were the 7 men generated. Earth was the female element, water the male. You'll see this over and over again. They'll talk about the sun and the moon being male and female, and the earth and the sky being male and female, and all this sort of gendered stuff. And fire from the ether they received their spirits, and nature produced bodies after the species and shapes of men. So there's these immortal 7, okay, these original 7, and then nature later shapes these bodies after the species and shapes in men. So these aren't the same thing as these higher order beings, what nature produced on earth, these shapes of men. And a man received the life and light of the great dragon. So for anybody that's familiar with Christian theology at all, if you're receiving a life or light from a great dragon, that's pretty antithetical to anything that a Christian, or I believe a Muslim, or those religious traditions would want to accept. If you're receiving lights from great dragons. But again, if you're an atheist, this is, all gibberish to you, right? Or religious superstition stuff, which believing it's crazy superstition is certainly healthier than believing it's true, but it also causes problems because other people are capable of believing it's true and acting out like it's true. So it's, whether you're an atheist or not, it's important to still be aware of this stuff, that there are people out here that accept and believe and practice these things. And of the life was made his soul, and of the light his mind, and so all these composite creatures containing immortality, but partaking of mortality, continued in this state for a duration of a period. They reproduced themselves out of themselves, for each was male and female. But at the end of the period, the knot of destiny was untied by the will of God, and the bond of all things was loosed. Then all living creatures, including man, which had been hermaphroditical, were separated, the males being set apart from themselves, and the females likewise, according to the dictates of reason. Now we have a reinterpretation of the fall in Genesis, going from, the traditional Old Testament interpretation, which is Adam and Eve did something they weren't supposed to do. The result was sin, and because of that, they lost immortality and were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and they're forced to undergo these burdens and stuff like that forever. Versus this situation where we had a paradisical situation in which we were all hermaphrodites, and we could narcissistically reproduce in and of ourselves. In other words, we could generate offspring on our own. We didn't need somebody else. We were perfect into and of ourselves, which is why I also take issue with a lot of these people that are, just do you and follow your thinking and, be the best version of yourself and focus on yourself and the answers are inside you and all this kind of stuff. It's like anything with that narcissistic of an interpretation where you don't have to humble yourself and openly admit that you need other people, that men need women and women need men. That's the natural state of affairs, that you have to learn from the different communication styles from each other and your different limitations and your different strengths and all that kind of stuff. And basically it helps make you a better person. No, we need to shove all that to the side. All the answers were really just inside of you the whole time. That's why I take issue with a lot of these belief systems in general, because they lack humility. Then God spoke the holy word within the soul of all things, saying, increase and increasing and multiply in multitudes, all you my creatures and workmanships. Let him that is endued with mind know himself to be immortal, and that the cause of death is the love of the body, and let him learn all things that are, for he who has recognized himself enters into the state of good. And we actually see this, I don't know if you're familiar with L. Ron Hubbard's fictional work turned religion, Scientology. It's largely based on you going through a gradual process of realization that your souls have been corrupted by, or your body has been corrupted by all these souls from an intergalactic war and all this nonsense. I kid you not. You can look it up on the website of choice here. This has been explicated many times at this point, the Lord Xenu stuff. But essentially, it's you have this internal realization that the truth was in you and the mortality was in you all along and all this gobbledygook. And we see that it was present in a lot of these ancient religions and was later codified into esoteric teachings and traditions in the Middle Ages, the 1800s, 1900s, etc., etc., and continues in the traditions of the things that we mentioned in the first paragraph, introductory paragraph of this book: Kabbalah, Tarot, Rosicrucianism, which we'll touch on next, Freemasonry, etc., etc. The name Hermes is derived from Herm, a form of Chiram, the personified universal life principle, generally represented by fire. The Scandinavians worshipped Hermes under the name Odin, the Teutons as Wotan, and certain Oriental people as Buddhas or Fo. I think that most of those early traditions many of the people in those early traditions would not accept that interpretation, by the way. There are two theories concerning his demise. The first declares that Hermes was translated like Enoch and carried without death into the presence of God. The second states he was buried in the valley of Ebron, and a great treasure placed in his tomb, not a treasure of gold, but of books of sacred learning. So, and you'll see this over and over again with these esoteric traditions, is they will go back and reference ancient literature, mythology, etc., and they'll retroactively try and say that's what these people were saying, and so they can tie their lineage all the way back to, the origins of the original belief systems of all these various indigenous peoples all over the world. And the thing is, if you actually study what those people say, it's a lot of times it's clearly not supposed to be the same thing as what they're stating here. So just point that out. But again, this section here in Manly P. Hall, we're seeing that this higher state is associated with this hermaphroditic state once again. And there's this male and female principle that we're always having to contend with. And we're receiving lights from great dragons in this hermaphroditical interpretation of cosmogony. Again, if you're alarmed by this, good, you should be. Which brings us now to Rosicrucianism, which we saw referenced in the Manly P. Hall book. So what is Rosicrucianism? It's a spiritual and cultural movement that arose in Europe in the early 17th century after several publications announcing the world a new esoteric order. Rosicrucianism is symbolized by the rosy cross or rose cross. And I will show you what that rose cross is actually supposed to be representative of by looking at a text here in a moment. Between 1610 and 1615, 2 anonymous manifestos appeared in Germany and soon after were published throughout Europe. The Fama Fraternitatis Rosicrucius, the fame of the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross, was published at Kassel in 1614, though it had been circulating in manuscripts among German occultists since about 1610. Johannes Valentinus Andrea had been considered the possible author of the work.
And let me just highlight that for a moment. We had an anonymous text published in Germany, started with a small occult group, and this grew to have a much more increased influence throughout Europe and arguably the world just from this anonymous situation. These esoteric ideas start with small occult groups and then expand and impact larger society. That's what we're observing here in microcosm with Rosicrucianism.
A literal reading narrates the travels and education of Brother CRC and his founding of a secret brotherhood of similarly prepared men. Names, numbers, and other details have Kabbalistic allusions in which cognoscenti of that era were well versed. The Confessio Fraternitatis, published in Frankfurt, responded to confusions and criticisms and elaborated the matter further. So the manifestos elaborate these matters extensively but cryptically in the terms of Kabbalah, Hermeticism, alchemy, Christian mysticism, subjects whose methods, symbolisms, and allusions were ardently studied by many intellectuals of the period. A third anonymous volume was published, The Chemical Wedding of the Christian Rosenkreuz. Johann Valentine Andrea acknowledged its origin as a romantic fantasy, but that he wrote it before he was 16 years old, among other forgotten juvenilia, and which elaborated in response to the fame of confession. It's a promise of spiritual transformation at a time of great turmoil, influenced many figures to seek esoteric knowledge. Philosophers such as Michael Mayer, Robert Flood, and Thomas Vaughan interested themselves in Rosicrucian worldview. It described Rosicrucian as arisen from a primordial tradition, saying our origins are Egyptian, Brahmic, derived from mysteries of Eleusis, Samothrace, and the Magi of Persia, Pythagoreans, and the Arab. And we see there's a connection to Freemasonry. Two Rosicrucian-inspired Masonic rites emerged toward the end of the 18th century. Rectified Scottish Rite widespread in Central Europe. There's a strong presence of the Golden Rosy Cross and the ancient accepted Scottish Rite. Many modern groups have styled themselves as Rosicrucian. They can be divided into 3 categories: esoteric Christian Rosicrucian groups, Masonic Rosicrucian groups, and initiatory groups such as the Golden Dawn and Ancient Mystical Order of Rosicrucians. And they say the Rosicrucian schools provide knowledge of the inner teachings of Christianity, which basically means it's going to say something completely different than any mainstream interpretation of Christian teaching. They're going to look at the text and pull out a bunch of allegories out of and basically entirely change the meaning of the text. And now we come to the secret doctrine of the Rosicrucians. Here we are, part 4, the universal androgyne. The birth of sex, the neuter becomes bisexual, the cosmic hermaphrodite, bisexuality in the universal manifestation, the inner teaching, the ancient mysteries, phallicism, the shadow of the truth, the symbol of universal bisexuality, the cross and the circle, the phallic cross, the swastika, the rose cross, and the male universal principle. So the third aphorism here, we are on page 49. The one became two, the neuter became bisexual, male and female, the two in one evolved from neuter, and the work of generation began. In this third aphorism of creation, the Rosicrucian is directed to apply his attention to the conception of the world soul, the first manifestation of the eternal past, as a bisexual universal being. Yet again, we're seeing this. This bisexual universal being, combining within itself the element and principles of both masculinity and femininity, is known in the Rosicrucian teaching as the universal hermaphrodite, the universal androgyne. The term hermaphrodite is defined as an individual has attributes of both male and female. The term is derived by joining together the two names, viz. Hermes and Aphrodite, which is why you see Hermes referenced over and over again. The term came into ancient use through the legend of Hermaphroditus, son of Hermes and Aphrodite, who while bathing became joined in one body with a nymph Salmacis. The term androgyne is defined as an individual possessing the attributes of both male and female. The term is derived from the combination of the Greek words andros, meaning man, and gyne, meaning a woman. The conception of bisexuality, when they're saying bisexuality here, they're not talking about attraction to both sexes. They're talking about a combined form. The conception of bisexuality in the universal manifestation or universal being is one met with on all sides in the ancient esoteric and occult philosophies in all lands. In ancient Greece, so once again we're seeing that multiple different esoteric traditions are all saying that each one of them says that there's this hermaphrodite being that's the ultimate state of affairs. Ancient India and ancient Atlantis, Persia and Chaldea, the doctrine formed an important part of the inner teachings. In its higher form, this teaching lay at the very heart of the ancient mysteries and resulted in the very highest and noblest conception of the dignity and worthiness of sex. But prostituted by the vulgar popular mind, encouraged by a debased priesthood, the same teachings were inverted and made to serve as the basis of the various degenerate phase of phallic worship, the traces of which are found on every page of ancient philosophical or religious history. The Rosicrucians have never countenanced even the slight descent into phallicism, but on contrary have kept alive the flame of the true teaching and have used it particularly as a symbol, as the particular symbol, as the distinctive symbol, name, and emblem of the order. So they're basically saying what? The Rosicrucian symbol, the rose cross, is representative of this hermaphroditic androgyne concept. You have a male principle and the flower, a female principle. In order to understand the symbology of the universal androgyne, it is necessary to first become familiar with the two ancient symbols of sex. In all the ancient philosophies and religions, we find that the cross is the symbol of the male, the circle the symbol of the female. In representing the bisexual, the hermaphrodite, the androgyne, the two symbols, the cross and circle are combined in one of several ways. The original way was placing the cross within the circumference of the circle, but later usage prefaced various forms of the so-called phallic cross, which consists of the circle or oval, sustaining the cross, which depends downward from it. So when you see stuff like this, this obviously has implications for the Christian tradition because their Savior was crucified on a cross. Now, there isn't any mainstream denomination of Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, mainstream Catholicism, Anglicanism, Protestantism, etc., that ascribe the cross as being a phallic symbol. It's a symbol of the death and resurrection of Jesus. And frankly, it's two pieces of wood that the Romans used to kill people on. That's what, I mean, if you're trying to crucify somebody, that's pretty much the only way to do it. So whether it bears symbolistic similarity between what other ancient cultures utilized to symbolize the male element of creative processes, I mean, it couldn't be, as far as crucifying somebody, it couldn't really be constructed any other way.
And this is why I take issue with esoteric systems. This is why I take issue with occulted systems, is because they look for secondary and tertiary interpretations of literally everything all the time. And when you do that, you can construct an entire world that allows you to justify whatever behavior that you want. So if you are an exceedingly wealthy person at the top of a pyramid and you're existing in, let's say, a highly monogamous culture, and as a result of, your wealth and all of the power at your disposal, you want to start engaging in relations with a bunch of different women because you have no self-control. Well, okay, why don't you erect a religious system like Gerald Gardner in the form of Wicca that allows you to sleep around with a bunch of women? We see this over and over again in occulted practices. Or if you were a homosexual, and guess what? In this time period, there's not going to be a lot of openly homosexual people around. So what do? You create a system in which homosexual behaviors are encouraged or perpetuated. I'm not saying that is all of why these systems emerge, because it's not. It's very clearly not. But I'm saying whenever you bring in this quote-unquote mystical interpretation all the time, you can use it to ultimately justify anything. And anytime somebody disagrees with you, you can just say, well, you don't have true enlightenment. You don't actually understand why we're doing this. You lack intellect, or you lack spiritual depth, or whatever else. And you can keep these wheels spinning forever, because by having all these multiple interpretations, it becomes extremely difficult to pin anything down. It makes it much easier for you to evade criticism whenever people try and leverage it towards you. And when your adherents go out and do execute behaviors or rites or what have you that winds up having negative impacts on society, you can simply just say, well, they were misinterpreting what I was saying or any. But again, as we'll see, the same sorts of patterns and behaviors emerge, even though these systems are different, that adhere to this sort of gender/sexuality-based framework. Certain behaviors are largely consistent between any groups or systems that enact this type of religious practice, let's say.
And that's where we get into trouble with so many of these esoteric symbols, is because they're looking for representation of some second, third, fourth interpretation of literally everything. And so you get caught in this loop of like you're constantly separating yourself from reality, in a sense, with all this stuff. And that's what we see increasingly in our modern culture with video game, virtual reality type stuff, people withdrawing into their phones, et cetera, et cetera. They would rather talk about the symbol of whatever X, Y, or Z thing is than what it actually does. It's if you look at how we've advanced through technologically, has been primarily through direct engagement with physical matter in the form of engineering type principles, which follow specific physical laws and solid state physics. So I don't want to get further and further away from that, because then you just retreat into an increasingly complex virtual representation that's further and further away from reality, which is why I have so many problems with these systems. But we see them also referencing the swastika here, as well as it being considered a esoteric symbol, as well as the circle, the cross, and a variety of other symbols. Another text, The Sacred Fire, The Story of Sex in Religion, by Mr. B.Z. Goldberg, on page 43. And they're referencing this lingam and yoni, which means they're talking about sex organs typically associated with, Eastern tradition. Here again, the evolution of the generative God followed the development of sex in nature. As man came to clothe his sex god with a human form, he had one individual contain both sex organs. Janus of the Greeks was not only double-headed, but double-sexed hermaphroditic and an internal reproducer. He was originally a single substance, but of his own free will, he divided himself into male and female. We find a similar story in the development of Purusa, the soul of the universe. At first, Purusa was alone. He did not enjoy any happiness. He desired a second being. So he caused himself to fall asunder in two parts. Thence arose a husband and a wife. From them men were born, but she reflected, How does he, after having produced me from himself, cohabit with me? So she became a cow, but he became a bull. From them kind were produced. Then she became a mare, and he turned himself into a stallion. From them the whole family of animals was undivided. Hooves were produced. In this manner pairs of all creatures whatsoever down to ants came into the world. But the hermaphroditic gods were only a transition in the development of the individual, male and female gods, and as such they were short-lived. They persisted into classical times, but only under the veil of mysticism from exotic natures. And here you have Siva, hermaphroditic god, eye in the center of the forehead, which is a symbolizing the union of the two creative forces, just in case you weren't aware. Again, later they say originally the gods were hermaphroditic and were worshipped by union of the opposite sexes. What does this mean? That means that the worship of these hermaphroditic gods took the form of people having sex with each other, quote-unquote sex magic or quote-unquote sex rituals. I kid you not, this is where this stuff leads here. As the hermaphroditic divinity separated itself into god and goddess, the worshippers may also have separated by sexes, the male serving the god, the female serving the goddess. When members of one sex exclusively worship a generative god, their service is well in danger of becoming homosexual. Still, it seems more simple and doubtless more psychological to assume that homosexual man preceded the homosexual worshiper, and that even in homosexualism, man only offered to his God what was dearest to him and all embracing in his life. We will talk in more detail about homosexuality after we talk about transgenderism, because we're going to go all the way through the esoteric stuff with transgenderism and then the development of transgenderism in the modern sense, and then differences in brain structure patterns, behavioral patterns, et cetera, to point to why this stuff is problematic. But we will come to that, but we see these ideas tied together with this hermaphroditic worship. Seeing the generative process in the union of the sex organs, primitive man came to conceive of it as essentially hermaphroditic in nature. And so the scarab, because it was believed to be double-sexed and capable of fructifying itself, became a sacred emblem. It was symbolic of the generative forces in nature. Once we see Egypt reference. In Egypt, it was the emblem of the Kafera, god of creation, father of gods and men, creator of all things, and the rising sun. In times of famine and poverty in medieval Europe, the people resorted to an old symbolic service to secure divine aid. In some places, the need fire was kindled by two naked men who rubbed dry sticks together, an action in itself symbolic of the sexual process. With the flame, they lighted two fires, between which the cattle were driven to ensure fertility in the herd. The ceremony was a form of magic. Just in case it hasn't gotten weird enough, we come to Opholioleatra, the rites and mysteries connected with the origin and rise and development of serpent worship, enriched with interesting traditions, and it's on the phases of phallic or sex worship. Here we are in chapter 3. He says, by combining the knowledge of the and legends of the East and West, we follow the outline of the mythology of the ancients, recognizes the primary element of things, two independent principles of the nature of male and female, and these in mystic union as soul and body constitute the great hermaphrodite deity, once again what we saw in Masonry, the one, the universe itself, consisting still of two separate elements of its composition, modified though combined in one individual, of which all things are regarded but as parts. And they say each of these deities can be resolved into one or the other of the primeval principles, the great god and goddess of the quote-unquote Gentiles. So by using reference of that terminology, clearly referencing Hebrew literature and the Old Testament by referring to them as Gentiles. So Egyptian refinement upon this idea adopted scarabs as a symbol of the first cause, the great hermaphrodite unity, for the reason that they believe that the insect to be both male and female, capable of self-inception, singular production, possessed of the power of vitalizing its own work. Chapter 5. The sun came to symbolize the active principle, the vivifying power, and how obviously the egg symbolized the passive elements of nature. So again, it's similar to what we saw in masonry with the Orphic egg, but how the serpent came to possess as a symbol a like significance with these is not so obvious. That it did so, however, cannot be doubted, and the proofs will appear as we proceed. Likewise, that it sometimes symbolized the great hermaphrodite first principle, the supreme unity of the Greeks and Egyptians. So now they're tying the snake to this idea of a great hermaphrodite, this hermaphroditic concept. And what have we seen already? We've seen concept of a snake swallowing its own tail in the form of the Ouroboros, and we see that symbology once again. Hora Polo, referring to the serpent symbol, says of it, when the Egyptians would represent the universe, they delineate a serpent bespeckled with variegated scales, devouring its own tail, the scales imitating the stars in the universe. The animal is extremely heavy, as is the earth, and extremely slippery like water. Moreover, it every year puts off an old age with skin. As in the universe, the annual period affects a corresponding change and becomes renovated, and the making use of its own body for food implies that all things whatever which are generated by the divine providence of the world undergo a corruption into them again. And also it's cannibalistic too. And here we come to the book Pagan Christ, Studies in Comparative Hierology by John M. Robertson. And we look at the rationales of religion, comparison and appraisal of religion. That's basically what this text specifies. The pre-Christian Jesus God, they say all this stuff. A gospel of mystery play, private Jewish Eucharist, special features of the crucifixion myth, outlining the development of this stuff. And here they specify offerings and human sacrifices. Again, this stuff just keeps getting weirder. And they say there's totem sacrifices in which the victim would be eaten, either as the god or as the mode of union with the god. Human sacrifices would be eaten along with the god as a thank offering or as a sin offering. Priest-blessed ritual sacrifice eaten as sacraments included totem sacrifices in which the god eats himself. So again, we see all this cannibalism stuff popping up over and over again with this stuff. But here we come to the part that's relevant to the transgenderism. Human sacrifices in which the victim represented the god had a special efficacy as being a king or a king's son, the firstborn or early son. In the case of goddesses, the sacrifice might be a virgin, and this concept would react on the conception of God in an aesthetic movement, making him either double-sexed or virtually sexless. For the sacrifice, nevertheless, the victim must latter be a rule. The victim must latterly be, as a rule, a criminal. These various victims might or might not be eaten. So we have this ritualistic, pagan tradition, what have you, that this author is trying to tie to Christianity for whatever motivational reason. But we see that in a lot of these sacrificial processes, in that process, they were considered double-sexed or non-sexed. And again, we see symbols of the sun and the moon being male and female. And the epicene of the double-sexed character is singularly preserved to us in the Mithraic monument of the Greco-Roman period, which we possess in our own British Museum, in which the divine slayer of the bull presents a face of perfect and sexless beauty, feminine in its delicate loveliness of feature, masculine in association with the male form. In such a combination, there's a direct influence of the old Akkado-Babylonian system on later Mazdian. From the old Akkadians, the Semites received the conception of the Trinity, the divine father and mother by the side of their son, the sun god, but their own ruling tendency was to give every god up to the highest and colorless, double or a wife, and in the final blending of these is the double-sex deity. We have the consummation of the idea. It was not special to Asia, for the Egyptians gave a double sex alike to moon, earth, air, fire, and water. fire, masculine as heat, female as light, and so on. The Greeks and Romans accepted the notion, but it's probably from Chaldea that it reached the myth Thrace. Again, it's very strange because the Trinitarian concept in Christianity doesn't resemble this father, mother by the side of the sun god. Like, that's not nowhere close to Christian interpretation of what the Trinity is supposed to represent. But it's interesting that he's tying this stuff together. But what we're seeing once again is this concept of double sex, reunification, consummation, a colorless double. All these sorts of ideas extend back many, many generations across many, many cultures and tend to carry with them bizarre ritualistic rites that I personally have no interest in participating in. Yet still weirder, we have the Tibetan Tantra, 7 initiation rituals. And what do we see? I'm the combined body of all Buddhas, the wrathful one. Who else is more powerful than I? All the potentialities of the Tathagatas converge in me. I'm the most powerful of the forceful ones. What I desire is the hearts of the 8 divisional demons. What I like to eat and drink is their flesh and blood. With fiery anger, he wrenched out all the hearts of the 8-dimensional demons and crushed them on the plain. After he revived them and said, when hungry, I am the being who eats the flesh of all the male demons. When thirsty, I drink the blood of the she-demons. When active, I tear the double-sexed demons to pieces. After saying this, he ate the hearts of all the 8 divisional demons who had committed sinful deeds. At the time of eclipse, he collected all the sinful flesh and blood of the demons into a heap as a sacrificial food to benefit the scorpions, and ate them all. Thereupon the 8 divisional demons called for help and begged for forgiveness. Then he agreed that at every eclipse time he would provide blood and flesh to the 8 divisional demons in the 3 regions, and thereby prohibited them from killing sentient beings. In order to prevent them from further slaughter, he gave them the Krum Ga, the chief mandala's food, personification of the mandala. Whoever among the demons would break the rules, he declared, would be punished and offered as a sacrificial food to numerous scorpions. We see this idea of the Buddha, in this sense, violently engaging with these spiritual beings and forces, which involves some double-sexed varieties, but ultimately also involves cannibalism. So we see a strange association between a lot of these ideas coming together across various cultures. And again, the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail, many sort of ritualistic, cannibalistic sacrifices. This isn't a neutral idea that carries no valence associated with it. This hermaphroditic thing. There's actions ascribed to these ideas in all of these cultures.
Which brings us now to the work of Edward Carpenter. And I'm going to touch on his book here in a moment after we review some stuff. And we're going to point out sort of where a lot of the tribal practical versions of direct transgenderism, not just hermaphroditism, was expressed in various cultures. So this Edward Carpenter character was a utopian socialist, poet, philosopher, and anthologist, and an early activist for gay rights. So this guy was born in 1844, and he was a gay rights activist and prison reform, whilst advocating vegetarianism and taking a stance against vivisection. Perfectly fine with taking a stance against vivisection. I'm fine with getting rid of that last one. As a philosopher, he was particularly known for his publication of Civilization, Its Cause and Cure. Here he describes civilization as a form of disease through which human societies pass. So, isn't it funny how all this stuff, vegetarianism, gay rights, socialism, building a utopia, and the idea that civilization is a problem, it's a disease, which basically means he's advocating for some form of primitivism, which we'll see expressed in his text, because he's basically, his lifestyle as a homosexual necessitated his desire to explore other cultures' participation in those activities and then find ways retroactively to justify them. In an early act of sexual liberation, he had an influence on both D.H. Lawrence, who his fiction basically known for championing sexual fantasies. He wrote Lady Chatterley's Lover, E.M. Forster's novel Maurice, and it's a tale of homosexual love in the 20th century. So this guy inspired a large part of the homosexual movement subsequent to this in the early 1900s. His father was Charles Carpenter. His brothers, Charles, George, and Alfred, also went to school. He displayed a flair for the piano, went to Trinity Hall, Cambridge. He came under the influence of Christian socialist theologian F.D. Maurice. Isn't it interesting that when you combine Christianity with socialism, the Christian ideas ultimately become subordinate to the socialist ones? Anytime, well, we're going to do Christian mysticism. Well, okay, all the Christian ideas will become subordinate to the mystical ones. And whenever a Christian objects, you'll point out that they don't have a true understanding, or you'll cite some Christian aspect or element of your belief system to try and dissuade them. And this is the same thing that happens in all the mystic interpretations of other religions or belief systems. And we see Christianity continually being applied to, queer theory or whatever else. And then immediately what happens? Well, it's not about Christianity anymore. It's about whatever the secondary thing is. Same thing when people try to do this with Islam or any other major religion. While there, he began to explore his feelings for men, and it goes on to describe the fact that he had quote-unquote relationships with them. He lectured in astronomy, the lives of ancient Greek women, and music, and had hoped to lecture to the working classes, but it found his classes were mostly attended by middle-class people, many of whom showed little active interest in the subjects he taught. He was disillusioned, moved to Chesterfield. He said his sexual preferences were for working men, the grimy and oil-besmeared figure of a stoker, a thick-thighed, hot, coarse flesh young bricklayer with a strap around his waist. So that's his homosexual predilection, is for something masculine, which in spite of other than his beard, it doesn't portray a very masculine countenance himself. He went to India and looked at their cultures and expressions and stuff like that. And then he later was with this George Merrill character. And he was in correspondence with all these famous people. And his literature works were published and disseminated by William Swan Sonnenschein. And he also published the works of George Bernard Shaw, Karl Marx, Edward Carpenter. Other major authors were J.M. Barrie, Henry James, George Meredith, and George Moore. So this Swan Sonnenschein figure was one of the disseminators of these major works that provided a cultural backing for a lot of subversive ideas. And later, the works of Edward Carpenter were continued into the modern era through this Jeffrey Weeks, a sociologist and gay activist, and Sheila Rowbotham. In other words, it's not like Edward Carpenter just generated these ideas, and because they were so fantastic and great, everybody just jumped on board. He had people that were making sure that at least the portion of the public that was interested in them, or that they felt like they could get a foothold into, was exposed to them. And here's his life partner, and here's the Christian socialist he was influenced by. And he was a preacher in a Unitarian chapel, which, if you know anything about Unitarianism, it certainly diverges from the traditional teachings of Orthodox Christianity, Catholicism, Protestantism, etc., etc. So why am I showing you all this stuff? Well, he wrote this book in 1914, Intermediate Types Among Primitive Folk, and he expands on Carpenter's idea of an intermediate type of person, a person of mixed sex, such as feminine body with a masculine mind and vice versa. Originally published in 1914, the text explores the role that intermediate types played amongst early civilization as well as in military situations. So he describes these feminine bodies with masculine minds and vice versa, and he says there wasn't much that was understood about it. He then goes on to blame Christianity for persecuting these groups of people. He says it might be easy to enter into a tirade against sex inversion. Remember, this is 1914 in general, and to point out and insist on all evils which may actually or possibly flow from it. But this would not be the method either of common sense or of science. So he's basically saying anybody that attacks this idea of gender inversion is primitive and unscientific. It is obvious that the procedure has to be different from this. One has to inquire first what advantages may have flowed or been reported from the tendency, what place it may have possibly occupied in social life, rather than its unhealthy manifestation. So he's basically saying we should start by assuming it's positive and working our way back.
I would say you could just as easily, and in fact probably more reasonably, look at what are the potential negative aspects that this could contribute to our existing society first, and see what the potential outcomes can be there. Because even if something sounds beneficial on paper, if you look at only the quote unquote benefits first, if the negatives result in population collapse or something to that effect, let's say, that would bear far more weight than, one individual's potential expression being hindered, particularly when we're not sure what inputs at this point in time contribute to an individual feeling in that manner in the first place, whether it be psychological or physiological.
He uses phrases like Dorian Greeks to imply homosexuality. He also used the term Uranian to apply homosexuality. Now, here's where it gets interesting. He says those with the Uranian temperament were often given prophetic gifts and divination. Basically, he's saying homosexuals were often the individuals that prophesied in some of these tribes. Of course, that in the temples and cults of antiquity and the primitive races, it has been a widespread practice to educate and cultivate certain youths in an effeminate manner, and that these youth in general became priests or medicine men of the tribe, but this fact has hardly been taken seriously as indicating any necessary connection between the two function in relation in general between homosexuality and psychic powers. We will talk about homosexuality in more detail and explicate potentially on why homosexual people might have quote-unquote visions, or what would potentially be viewed by older societies as being quote-unquote psychic powers. I would argue it's not beneficial. But again, our focus right now is on transgenderism. So there is the connection here, though, that you'll see pop up over and over. The neighborhood of the Bering Straits, the Kamchadales, the Chukchi, the Aleuts, the Inuits, the Kadiak Islanders, and so forth, homosexuality is common, and its relationship to shamanship or priesthood most marked and curious. So these are Native American tribes, essentially, or under the supernatural influence of one of their shamans or priests. A Chukchi lad at 16 years of age will suddenly relinquish his sex and imagine himself to be a woman. So the shamans that are consuming psychedelics and doing all these sorts of ritualistic practices, as we'll see touched on here, will influence a 16-year-old, and they will suddenly start dressing like a woman. And of course, the Mr. Carpenter's arguing that this is a beneficial thing, by the way, in 1914. Lets his hair grow, devotes himself to female occupation. Furthermore, this disclaimer of sex takes a husband into the yurt and does all the work, which is usually incumbent on the wife. Basically meaning they act in a homosexual manner. In most unnatural and voluntary subjection, these abnormal changes of sex imply the most abject immorality in the community, appear to be strongly encouraged by the shamans who interpret such cases an injunction of their individual deity. In other words, the shamans, who themselves are often homosexuals or expressing transgender tendencies, encourage homosexual behavior on the part of a man and another man dressed as a woman. Gee, I wonder why a homosexual guy would want to encourage a practice in which homosexual behavior is encouraged. Furthermore, Westermarck says the change of sex is usually accompanied by future shamanship. Indeed, Nearly all the shamans were former delinquents of their sex. So people practicing abnormal behavior are regarded as shamans, given these mystical authorities, and the shamans perpetuate this by saying, let me encourage this particular youth to engage also in homosexual behavior so they can become a shaman. In describing the Koryaks, men occupy the position of concubines, and he compares them with the Kamchadale Kokuk, as he calls them. That is, a man transformed into woman. He's regarded as a magician and interpreter of dreams. Gee, I bet the interpretation of the dream is going to be homosexual with me. There is no indication that North American Aborigines attached any opprobrium to men who had intercourse with those members of their own sex who had assumed the dress and habits of women. Far from being despised, were held in repute by the people, most of them being wizards. Has a boy with a pretty face, also a graceful demeanor, the mother no longer permits him to associate with the companions of his own age, but clothes him and brings him up as a girl. So, again, it's associated with this particular religious practice, shamanship. And I also think this is one of the reasons they're pushing psychedelics as hard as they do, because that a lot of these tribes were doing that. And the passive nature in which you're encouraged whenever you're guided through a psychedelic trip, essentially let it go, don't fight it, all that kind of stuff, don't try to resist it, just let it take over you. Those are the exact processes you do to give up your own conscious mind, and we're seeing those practices lead to homosexual behavior and transgenderism. Chopins or use of this kind are highly prized by the Konyagas. On the other hand, there are to be met herewith and there among the Esquimau or kindred populations, especially in the Yukon, girls who decline marriage and maternity, changing their sexes so they speak, they live as boys, adopting masculine manners and customs. They hunt the stag and in the chase shrink with no danger and have no fatigue. He says, among the Illinois Indians, the effeminate men assist all the juggleries and the solemn dance in honor of the calumet or sacred tobacco pipe, for which the Indians have such a deference. So they're consuming the sacred pipe, but they are not permitted either to dance or to sing. They're called into councils of the Indians and can be decided without their advice. The Sioux, Sacs, and Fox Indians, he continues, give once a year or oftener a feast to the Berdashi or Aikukua, who is a man dressed in a woman's clothes as he has been all his life. So this was, practiced pretty extensively among the Native American tribes. He may quote the remark of Herodotus, who, after mentioning that some of the Scythians suffered from a disease of effeminacy and were called Inaries, that these Inaries or Androgyni were endowed by Venus with the power of divination, and they were consulted by the king of the Scythians when the latter was ill. The Jesuit Father Lafitau, so remember, we looked at the Jesuits. What do they believe? They believe in this divine androgyne too, who published in 1724 at Paris an extremely interesting book on the manners and customs of North American tribes, among whom he had been a missionary. After speaking of warlike women and Amazons, if some of the women were found possessing virile courage and glorying in the profession of war, which seems only suitable for men, there exists also men so cowardly as to live like women. Among the Sioux in Louisiana and Florida and in the Yucatan, there are found youths who adopted the garb of women, preserve it all their life. Asiatic, he said, would these not be the same type of folk as the Asiatic worshippers of Cybele, or those of the Easterners whom Julius Firmicus speaks, who consecrated to the goddess of Phrygia or Venus Urania certain priests who dressed as women, who affected an effeminate countenance, who painted their faces and disguised their true sex under garments, borrowed from the sex which they wished to counterfeit. The Inares among the Scythians, who by excess riding were often rendered impotent and effeminate, is very curiously paralleled in quite another part of the world of the so-called Urados, or feminized men, among the Pueblo Indians of Mexico. Dr. W.A. Hammond, who was stationed in 1850 as a military doctor in New Mexico, reported that in each village one of the strongest men was compelled by unintermitted riding to pass through this kind of metamorphosis. So they basically made them ride a horse till it caused so much problems with the amount of friction that they were experiencing on their reproductive organs that they basically stopped producing the same level of male hormones, and so they weren't able to complete puberty. He then became indispensable for the religious orgies, which were celebrated among the Pueblo Indians in the same way they once were among the Greeks, Egyptians, and other people. These Saturnalia take place among the Pueblos in the spring of every year and are kept with the greatest secrecy from the observation of non-Indians. Yeah, I'd be one to hide that too if I was doing stuff like that. And again, to be a Murado is no disgrace to the Pueblo Indian. He enjoys the protection of his tribes people and is accorded a certain amount of honor. Coming down a little bit further, the Hebrews entering Syria, says Richard Burton, found it religionized by Assyria and Babylonia when the Akkadian Ishtar had passed west and had become Ashtoreth, Ashtaroth, and Asherah, and the Anitis of Armenia, the Phoenician Astarte, and the Greek Aphrodite, the great moon goddess who is queen of heaven and love. She was worshipped by men, habited as women, and vice versa. For which reason in the Torah, he's citing Deuteronomy here, the sexes are forbidden to change dress. So basically, in Assyria and Babylon, in the Old Testament, encounter these cultures, and the Hebrews were put into captivity in Babylon at one point, and they had these temples where basically men were dressed up like women and women were dressed up like men, and that was part of their religious practice, and the Hebrews expressly forbade it, which is interesting centuries later when you have rabbis stating this hermaphroditic nature to the world, as we've already described earlier in this lecture. King Josiah, we are told that the king commanded Hilkiah the high priest and the priests of the second order and the keepers of the door to bring out forth of the temple of the Lord's all the vessels that were made for Baal and for the grove and for the host of heaven, and he burned them without Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron, and he brake down the houses of the Sodomites. This is homosexuals, that's what this is referring to, because of the nature of their practice, that they were by the house of the Lord, where the women wove hangings for the grove. The word translated Sodomites is Hebrew word Kedishim, meaning the consecrated ones, and occurs again in Kings. The word grove is Asherah. There is some doubt, I believe, to the exact function of the Kedeshim in their temple ritual, and some doubt as to whether the translation of the word in our authorized version is justified. It is clear, however, that these men corresponded in some way with the Kedeshoth, or sacred women, who were like the Devadasis of the Hindu temples, a kind of prostitute dedicated to the god, and strange as it may seem to the modern mind, it is probable that they united some kind of sexual service with prophetic function. They were temple prostitutes, and they were female prostitutes, and there were also male prostitutes dressed up like women, and this was a part of Baal worship during this time frame. And by this time frame, we're speaking specifically of the Old Testament. Again, like let's say you're atheist or something and you don't believe in the historicity of the Old Testament. That's not the point that I'm making here one way or the other. The point I'm making is there's records that are thousands of years old that were recorded stating that these actions were taking place and ascribing this association. And we've already fast forwarded to look at Rosicrucianism, Freemasonry, etc., and seen that some variation of these ideas has survived up till now. Okay, so we have multiple thousand years of lineage of these ideas, and we're seeing them being transferred generation to generation through secretive esoteric societies, secret rites, secret rituals, etc. The prophets were constantly called, men in whom the gods manifested themselves from time to time by word and deed, incarnations of the deity. While the prophets roamed freely about the country, the Kedishim appeared to have been regularly attached to a sanctuary. There were clearly some which revolted the conscience of men imbued with pure morality. So there's this male and female partners of Baal and these things that these individuals were tied to. The religious worship of the Canaanites. There were male courtesans attached to the temples and inhabiting their precincts, as well as consecrated females, and that the ceremonies connected with these cults are of markedly sexual character. These ceremonies had probably originated in an ancient worship of sexual acts,
as being symbolic of and therefore favorable to the fertility of nature and crops. They were detested by the moral, zealous adherents of Jehovah because, for one reason at any rate, they belonged to the rival cult of the Syrian Baal or Ashtoreth. So basically, he's positioning himself. He's basically saying, because he's pro-homosexual, the author of this work, Edward Carpenter, he's describing the Hebrews during this time period as being zealots and basically closed-minded, and basically saying, look how wonderful some of these ritualistic processes were because of the shamanistic capabilities of the individuals involved. And this is part of the reason why I spent all that extra time covering all those relationship lectures and pointing out all these benefits in pair bonding and monogamy and all these problems that appear concomitantly with promiscuity. Like we looked at brain structures in the form of sexual addiction and pornography and all that kind of stuff, to see that you really can't engage in reckless sort of non-monogamous sexual behavior all over the place and have zero consequences for it. It's not purely a physical act. It's not purely just an act that you can perform and then have no consequences associated with it. There's very powerful memories associated with it. And I also established all these structures in the brain that are associated with pair bonding. And I do think, although I didn't make that point in those lectures, that you could very easily make the case, and you could, if modern researchers wanted to do this, I believe it's a hypothesis that could be confirmable, that monogamy is in fact neuroprotective. In other words, it's protective of the brain, monogamous relationships. And because we do see that, in fact, as I established in previous lectures, monogamous relationships from partners that have only been with each other are the most stable. They tend to produce the happiest relationships, happiest marriages, most stable marriages. And that also produces better offspring because marriages that are focused on the spouses do better than marriages that are focused on the children. And we see all those pair bonding structures in place, and they've sort of been primed by a relationship with another human being. And a lot of those pair bonding structures also fire in relation to children as well. So it does make sense to me, in a very real sense, that people who are highly promiscuous potentially impair those structures or the bonding mechanism if they do have children, or they have, a mistake pregnancy, quote unquote, or something like that, why they often don't potentially feel as attached to their children. That narrative will come up again as much later. But these things do kind of cascade into each other. So Mr. Carpenter is trying to argue from a homosexual position. We're not talking about homosexual as much as transgender, but we'll remember this for when we talk about homosexuality. From this position, he's saying there's all these beneficial features of this male-female inversion, etc. Look at all these ancient civilizations that practice this stuff. He also says, with regard to Syria in the Bible, Dr. Fraser points out the curious likeness here to the customs existing today among the Negroes of the slave coast of West Africa. Women called Kosio are attached to the temples as wives, priestesses, and temple prostitutes of the Python god. So this is in 1914. He's saying this is still taking place in West Africa. But besides these, there are the male Kosio as well as the female Kosio. That is, there are dedicated men as well as dedicated women, priests as well as priestesses, and the ideas and customs in regard to them seem to be similar. The points of resemblance between the prophets of Israel and of West Cross Africa are close and curious. Must be said, however, that Dr. Fraser does not into either case to insist on the inference of homosexuality. Throughout China and Japan, much of Malaysia, Buddhist priests have used their boys attached to the service of the temples. Each priest educates a novice to follow him in ritual. Said the relations between the two are often physically intimate. They said that intercourse with a woman for them was for a deadly sin or even punishable with death, but that the other relation was by no means execrable but harmless, even commendable. They say homosexual relations are not forbidden. So he's basically tying this all over the world, but in doing so, he's basically pointing to pedophilia or the practice of pederasty, in which individuals, basically an older mentor would raise up a younger boy, and that would often include a sexual element to it. Every temple of the chief house of worship keeps one or two men or more, according to the idol, who go about attired like women even from their childhood, and talk like women and imitate them in the manner and carriage and all else. They served in the temples and were made almost as if by way of sanctity and religion. So there's much more that could be explicated in here, and we will return to this book when we go into more detail about homosexuality. But I want to point out that there is this association in the Native American tribes, specifically, multiple areas observed. We see this in Greece. We see this in Rome. We see these practices in the ancient civilizations that conflicted with the Hebrews in the Old Testament time period, at least according to their written records. We see similar practices in Africa, even in a more modern context. And so the question is, well, why should we care? After all, I mean, if they're just engaging in this sexual behavior, but nobody's getting hurt, why should we care, right? Because he's saying these punitive Christian religions came back later. Again, the purpose of this lecture is not Christian apologetics, okay? That's not the point I'm trying to make. If you can't zoom out further than that and look at this stuff and try and hop on this or that argument, you're missing the point, okay? Returning to the Inare, who were the Scythian group that were basically forced to ride horses until they became effeminate. They are affiliated to an orgiastic cult of the goddess, ancestral snake-legged goddess, in their form strongly influenced by the Near Eastern fertility goddess. The hermaphroditic / transgendered alteration people were associated with orgies and snake worship, which we already touched on snake worship earlier. They practiced Anaria, belonged to the most powerful Scythian aristocracy, born male, wore woman's clothing. They stated it was divine origin, caused sexual impotency. They may have been influenced by the populations of Eurasian steppe since the Paleolithic. It is unknown whether they practiced ritual castration or not. They also practiced sodomy, as we've already talked about. So then we come to Baal, okay, which supposedly stands for owner in the Northwest Semitic languages. So they talk about in Semitic religions and various forms of Baal and references to Jezebel tried to introduce Baal worship and conflicts with the Hebrew religions. It's also shown in association with the concept of Baal-el-Zebub or Beelzebub as the name of the Philistine god of Ekron, king of Israel. The prophet Elijah, incensed at this impiety, then foretold that he would die quickly, raining heavenly fire on the soldiers sent to punish him for do so. Jewish scholars have interpreted the title of the Lord of the Flies as a Hebrew way of calling Baal pile of dung and his followers vermin. Septuagint refers to the name Beelzebub. Symmachus of the Ebionite rendered it as Beelzebub, possibly reflecting this original sense. Outside of classic sources, it's referred differently as Belus in the Greek. And Josephus, who states that Jezebel built a temple to the god of the Tyrians. In Christianity, Beelzebub was identified by the writers of the New Testament as Satan, or prince of demons. In John Milton's epic Paradise Lost, fallen angels collecting around Satan, stating that though their heavenly names have been blotted out and raised, they would acquire new ones wandering o'er the earth as false gods. Balaam and Ashtaroth are given as the collective name of the male and female demons respectively, who came from between the bordering flood of old Euphrates. The Quran also warns against Baal worship. Elijah was among the messengers when he said to his people, "Will you not fear Allah? Do you call upon Baal and leave the best of the creators?" Okay, so why does all that stuff matter to us? Well, if you look at a lot of these shamanistic, whatever type cultures all over the world, we see they tend to practice child sacrifice. Okay, so we have the Aztec culture, probably the most well-known for child sacrifice. Inca culture, Maya culture. Other methods of sacrifice include strangulation, leaving children and giving them intoxicating drink. Mayan culture, supernatural beings had power in lives. The Kex infants would substitute more powerful humans, thought that they would consume the souls of more powerful humans, and the infants were substituted in order to prevent that. So they were providing child sacrifice. Ancient Near East, the Tanakh of King Moab, they were giving their firstborn sons. You see bands, the Old Testament, and what do they reference here? Well, they didn't put this in the Baal article, but numerous times in the Old Testament, what are all these Baal worshipers doing? They're sacrificing children to Baal. Biblical scholar Mark S. Smith argues that the mention of Topheth in Isaiah indicates an acceptance of child sacrifice in the early Jerusalem practices, to which in law Leviticus forbids child sacrifice, is a response. So we have this association in all of these previous cultures that worshipped Baal that Mr. Carpenter leaves out, is that they're sacrificing children. Again, continued on. Gehenna, Japheth's daughter, Phoenician and Carthage. Sacrifice among the Canaanite groups is attested in numerous sources spanning over millennia. Who did the Canaanites worship? Baal. And what's associated with Baal worship? These homosexual, transgender diviners and shamans. Again, references throughout the Greek literature here, pre-Islamic Arabia. Quran documents pagan Arabians sacrificing their children to idols. So it does seem that Christianity, early forms of Judaism, pre-Christian Judaism, and Islam all served as bulwarks against the practices of child sacrifice, given how ubiquitous it is. And those were all considered pagan cultures. And what do all those pagan cultures that we find so ubiquitously also have in common? Again, their shamanistic and religious practices are being led by homosexuals and individuals that are practicing transgender type behavior. I gave you the whole pathway here. I'm not making this up. South Africa and Uganda, and this is actually contemporary in South Africa. Murder within black communities of children of all ages for body parts, which is to make muti for purposes of witchcraft, still occurs in South Africa. Muti murders occur throughout South Africa, especially in rural areas. Traditional healers or witch doctors often grind up body parts and combine them with roots, herbs, seawater, animal parts, and ingredients to prepare potions and spells for their clients. In the 21st century, Uganda has experienced a revival of child sacrifice. In spite of government's attempts to downplay the issue, an investigation ran into human sacrifice in Uganda, found that ritual killings of children are more common than authorities admit. So this isn't something that's just gone away. Looking at ancient origins, there is this association between Moloch and Baal. And again, I actually have referenced Moloch in a previous lecture. In the Where We Are and Where We're Going lecture, I referenced the movie Metropolis in association with the concept of technocracy in a technocratic state. And in that silent film that's essentially 100 years old at this point, the worker class is sacrificed to a Moloch in the substructure of the technological superstate. So again, these ideas are being allowed to extend themselves into contemporary times. They're not staying in the past. It comes from the idea of meaning king. Again, his common name in Phoenician, Canaanite, for example, translate to king of men. So again, all these cultures that Mr. Carpenter has associated with, and here we see bull imagery, we'll see goat imagery again, and they're trying to retroactively go back and say that child sacrifice wasn't happening. We have archaeological evidence of this, so I don't know why we trying to retroactively go back and pretend like child sacrifice wasn't happening, because we have these large superstructures and continuation of these traditions. And ancient Babylon, because we didn't reference Babylon, we referenced the Canaanites and many other cultures, Native American type cultures were also referenced. And I don't know where this comes from, because there's this idea that the Native Americans were primarily peaceful peoples. A good source to reference for that is S.E. Gwynn's Empire of the Summer Moon. I'm not saying I agree with everything S.E. Gwynn says or anything like that, but the idea that these tribes were functionally peaceful is simply not true. There was a great deal of ritualistic sacrifice going on in all those cultures. Gang sexual assault was common.
although much more so in some tribes than others. Some tribes were far more peaceful than others. But you had gang sexual assault, obviously scalping, things of that nature.
Here's that book if you're interested. It is more focused on the Comanche than anyone else, but they were the most violent tribe was also the most powerful one, if that conveys anything to you.
Cannibalism was very common. In fact, there's a story during the French and Indian War in which there were some Indian tribes that defected to the Americans and then were captured by the French and Indians, and many of them were eaten alive in front of their family, cannibalistically, as a warning not to cross those other tribes again. So this idea that these tribes are essentially peaceful is not true. And again, they're all performing these secretive rites involving this transgender / homosexual type behavior. And if we extend that back to, ancient Babylonian cultures, as we're about to see, fiery rites were not unknown in Babylonia and Assyria. Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold. He commanded everybody to worship him and blah, blah, blah. In the Quran, it's related that Abraham destroyed the images of the Chaldean gods. To punish the offender, Nimrod had a great pyre erected at Cutha. Then they bound Abraham, putting him into an engine, shot him into the midst of the fire, in which he was preserved by the angel Gabriel, who was sent to his assistance. So this is in the Quran, not in the Old Testament, but it is a interpretation of what happened there. Eastern Christians were want to be set apart in the Syrian calendar. But essentially what we're seeing here is that both Babylon and Assyria, that were practicing all these same sexual, men dressing up as women, all that kind of stuff, those groups of people were given authority in society. Those transgender, what our modern version of transgender would be considered, were given authority in society. They determined the rites and rituals. They were the ones that were respected. They were the ones that that performed the shamanistic practices. They were the ones that performed the spells and all that kind of stuff. And we've seen how this manifests all over the world. And the way that it manifests all over the world is people kill babies. People get sacrificed.
Now, I am not saying that this is a one-to-one relationship or that every transgender person is secretly wanting to go out and kill children. That's not what I'm ascribing here. That's demonstrably untrue. But I'm saying whatever psychological, spiritual, religious practices contribute to transgender expression, and we'll talk about homosexuality more later when we delve into that specifically, are associated with a lot of these bizarre practices. And that shouldn't go unnoticed when transgendered people are given an outsized role in these same practices. And we'll look at differences in brain structure and differences in psychological conditions and all that stuff with transgender and non-transgender people. And it will make sense why we might see higher instances of abnormal behaviors in cultures in which transgender people are given elevated status.
And we see that this tradition has been kept alive within the mystery religions. Rosicrucianism, we saw it referenced in Manly P. Hall's work, Secret Teachings of All Ages, which includes Kabbalah, Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, etc., etc. And they've provided a cosmogony to explain this behavior, which is that there is a hermaphroditic God at the apex whose state we are trying to return to. And what sorts of practices do cultures who adhere to this sorts of wind up manifest? So it's not this benign thing that this homosexual man, Mr. Carpenter, is acting like it is. So we're going to make this a little bit more contemporary. We're going to look at the origins of sort of modern transgenderism. But let's not lose sight of this backdrop here, because we have a lot of people that want to cherry pick history a little bit. Well, there's been transgender people identified in cultures and ancient cultures all over the world. Yeah, and what kind of practices did they engage in? What kind of behaviors did they engage in? Were these healthy cultures? Did they manifest, look at the sorts of ways that they treated, they were highly respected. Well, okay. and they were given all sorts of authority. Okay, well, how come until we started producing cultures that encouraged monogamy, Western civilization and Asian cultures, and stable nuclear family relationships, and we got rid of all these orgiastic processes, why did we have to wait until that point to reach this level of technological ascendancy? I mean, monogamous cultures are going to be more stable, period. You're going to have guys stacking up on the bottom and women and more women going to the men at the top, in which case you're going to have males that don't care about what happens to your society, and it's going to be more unstable.